Hello, and thanks for stopping by. Nestled between Whitehall and Buckingham Palace, and flanked by the Mall and Birdcage Walk, St James's Park is London's most central green space, and a very beautiful one at that too. 57 acres of striking flora and fauna, all centred around a picturesque lake. Each year, around 5.5 million people visit St James's Park, and it's easily one of the capital's most photographed spots. Beyond the park's serene surface though, there lies a long and fascinating history, some aspects of which are surprisingly dark. And in this video, I'd like to share the intriguing story of St James's Park with you. Many centuries ago, the geography which defined this part of London was strikingly different. Back then, the Thames was wider and shallower, and its convergence with the now lost stream, known as the Tyburn, formed a small island known as Thorney Island, the spot upon which Westminster Abbey and the Houses of Parliament now stand. Just west of Thorney Island lay a marshy, wooded backwater, the area that would later become St James's Park. And thanks to its isolated nature, early Londoners figured it would make the ideal spot for a leper hospital. The hospital in question, which was built specifically for female sufferers of that dreadful disease, was founded in 1189, and it stood here, on the site now occupied by St James's Palace. It was named after St James the Less, who, according to tradition, was the first bishop of Jerusalem, as well as being the patron saint of pharmacists, hat makers, and, dying. It's from him then that St James's Park and the surrounding area gets its name. Over time, St James the Less Hospital was bequeathed more land, which the female patients used to raise pigs. Then, in 1449, custody of the land and hospital was granted to Eton College. St James the Less Leper Hospital led a quiet existence for almost 350 years. That is, until Henry VIII showed up. His burgeoning residence, the Palace of Whitehall, was located nearby, and he dubbed the hospital a leprous eyesore. In the early 1530s therefore, Henry seized the land and had the hospital knocked down, although he did offer some compensation by granting the village of Chatham in Suffolk to Eton College in return. The bombastic monarch then had the boggy land drained, walled off the park, and set about transforming it into his own personal playground, creating areas for bowls and jousting. Deer were raised here too, primarily for the purpose of having them carted off to larger royal parks where they could be hunted for sport. Henry VIII also commenced construction of a grand red brick building on the site of the former hospital, which he intended to act as a retreat from the larger Palace of Whitehall, a place he could use both as a hunting lodge and a cosy hideaway, where he could spend time with his then mistress, Anne Boleyn. That building is what we now know as St James's Palace, although Anne never got to enjoy it. She was beheaded before it was even complete. Although St James's Park was strictly private during the Tudor period, the public were sometimes granted access. In 1539, for example, 15,000 people were allowed in to witness Henry VIII review the city's militia. And when Elizabeth I was on the throne, she sometimes held fetes within the park. A few decades later, King James I, in a way similar to Henry VIII, used the park to indulge in his own interest too, his hobby being exotic animals. Over time, James was gifted many creatures by foreign monarchs and dignitaries, the animals being kept within a menagerie in the park, which included camels, crocodiles, and even an elephant, which, it's said, was fond of red wine. During the park's early days, there was no lake in the middle as there is today. Back then, the main water feature was a large pond known as Rosamond's Pond, which was sited in the park's southwestern corner. Rosamond's Pond was a popular meeting spot for lovers, although sadly, it also gained a reputation as a place where people would come to take their own life. It was filled in 1770. As he had the English Civil War to deal with, James I's successor, Charles I, had little time to tend to St James's Park. However, after being found guilty of treason, he spent his last few days as a prisoner in St James's Palace, and when the day of his execution arrived, on the bitterly cold day of the 30th of January 1649, he requested that he be allowed to walk through the park. This was granted, and led by guards to an ominous slow drum beat, and it's said, accompanied by his faithful dog, Rogue, Charles would have walked through the northern part of the park, across the area now covered by Horse Guards Parade, and over to the banqueting house at Whitehall, outside of which a scaffold had been built for his public beheading. In fact, if you look at the clock above Horse Guards Parade, opposite the banqueting house, you'll see a small black mark beside the number 2, marking the time at which the executioner's axe fell, 2 PM. With Charles I gone, Oliver Cromwell stood in to lead the Commonwealth of England, the brief period in which the nation became a republic. As a strict Puritan, Cromwell had little time for the pleasures in life, and this joyless attitude extended to St James's Park. He decreed that all the park's trees were free for the public to cut down and use as firewood, and as you might expect, this destructive bonanza meant the park was quickly transformed into a rough, barren space of stagnant waters and desolation. With this physical decline came a social one too, for St James's Park began to attract those who lurked on the fringes of society, turning it into a bad neighbourhood with a reputation for vice. Following the execution of his father, the young Charles II fled to France, but after Oliver Cromwell's death in 1658, the people, disillusioned with the dreary Commonwealth, invited the exiled king to return and restore the monarchy. Once back in London, Charles II set about restoring the various entertainments which had been banned under Cromwell, and embraced a hedonistic lifestyle which earned him the nickname the Merry Monarch. Having spent time there as a child, Charles II was familiar with St James's Park, and as part of his jolly overhaul, he decided it needed to be restored to its former glory, transformed into a grand landscaped garden, like the ones he'd seen in France. The king entrusted this work to the celebrated French landscape gardener, André Le Nôtre, who blessed St James's Park with orchards, grand boulevards, and a 2,800 foot, 850 metres long canal. When the Doge of Venice heard of this canal, he presented Charles II with 2 gondolas to use upon it. Like James I, Charles II also harboured a passion for animals, especially birds, and he began to obtain exotic species which were housed along the park's southern perimeter, hence the road's name, Birdcage Walk. One of the keepers of the king's birds was Edward Storey, and it's after him that Storey's Gate, where there did indeed used to be a gate controlling access to the park, at the eastern end of Birdcage Walk, is named. Today, you can see this former lodge at Storey's Gate, which was built in the 1840s for the park's warden. In later years, it served as a police station, and it's now home to a cafe. The pride of Charles II's aviary was a pair of pelicans, which were gifted to the king by the Russian ambassador in 1664. Incredibly, the pelicans are a species of bird which remain in St James's Park to this day. Although they don't breed here, they're introduced periodically into the environment. You can often see them cruising along the lake like a little armada, and if you're lucky, it's also possible to spot them during feeding time, which occurs daily, usually between 2:30 and 3 p.m. Towards the north of the park meanwhile, Charles II had a set of courts built for the purpose of playing the French game Paille-Mêlée. You'll have to forgive my pronunciation, a sport similar to croquet. As Samuel Pepys wrote in his diary on April 2nd, 1661, to St James's Park, where I saw the Duke of York playing at Pall Mall, the first time that I ever saw the sport. As you may have already guessed, it's from this connection that the two roads, Pall Mall and the Mall, the broad red tarmac avenue leading towards Buckingham Palace, get their name. Despite these improvements, St James's Park still maintained a seedy reputation, for after dark, it was a place where all manner of mischief, namely crime and sexual deviancy, thrived. The atmosphere of the park during that era was perhaps best summed up in the poem A Ramble in St James's Park, which was written by John Wilmot, the second Earl of Rochester, a subversive figure who was portrayed by Johnny Depp in the 2004 film The Libertine. In the poem, which was first published in 1680, the Earl describes the Sodom and Gomorrah-like behaviour he witnesses in the park, the all-sin sheltering grove as he describes it. And, although I'm certainly no prude, the language and imagery he invokes are both shocking and vile, even to 21st century ears, so much so that I'm unable to recite any of it here. If you're curious to read the poem for yourself though, I'll leave a link to the text in the description below. Although be warned, it's not for the faint-hearted. Violence was also commonplace in St James's Park at this time. It was said, for example, that at night the area was a favourite haunt of one of London's earliest gangs, the Mohawks, a bunch of well-to-do young men who seemingly revelled in carrying out vicious, random assaults, such as running swords through passing coaches. Duels were fought here, and murder wasn't unknown either, the most notorious case being that of George Burrington, whose beaten body was discovered in the canal in February 1759. According to a news report at the time, Burrington was gently dressed and his body had lain undiscovered for several days. Born in Devon in 1682, Burrington had twice served as the governor of North Carolina, during which time he made many enemies, for by all accounts, he was a truly obnoxious individual. His killer was never identified, and although it was assumed Burrington had been the victim of a robbery gone wrong, there were some who speculated that his violent death had in fact been the result of his checkered past catching up with him. In August 1814, during the reign of King George III, a huge public celebration was held in St James's Park to mark what was believed to be the final victory over Napoleon, although as we now know, he was back the following year for the Battle of Waterloo. To set the scene, a 7-storey tall pagoda was built along with a Chinese bridge over the canal, and on the night, Handel's music was played whilst crowds eagerly awaited what promised to be a fantastic fireworks display. Unfortunately, a lamp ignited the fireworks before their time came, resulting in a large blaze, which destroyed the pagoda, killing 2 people in the process. The bridge survived though, and was later replaced with a small suspension bridge, which in turn was replaced in the 1950s with the current incarnation. It was designed by Eric Bedford, who insisted it should always be painted light blue so as not to disturb the view of the lake. And during the Cold War, it was rumoured that the Blue Bridge was a popular meeting point for spies and their handlers. A few years after the pagoda blaze, the gluttonous Prince Regent, the future King George IV, commissioned the architect John Nash to give St James's Park a complete makeover. And as such, it's Nash's design which defines this beautiful area today. Nash introduced gas lighting to the park, which made it much safer after dark, and also did away with the by then stagnant canal, replacing it with the more natural looking lake. In doing so, he created Duck Island, close to Horse Guards Parade and the back of Downing Street, which, with its little Swiss-inspired cottage, is one of the park's quirkiest features. The cottage was initially built in the 1840s in conjunction with the Ornithological Society of London as a purpose-built residence for the park's birdkeeper. It served in this role for many years, although following bomb damage during the Blitz, it became uninhabitable and lay in a state of decay until it was fully restored in 1982. In World War I, the lake was completely drained. There were two reasons for this. Firstly, it was believed its silvery reflection at night would aid Zeppelin airships when targeting London. And secondly, the reclaimed space was used to erect temporary government buildings geared towards the war effort. These huts remained in place until the 1920s, by which point they were decaying and considered an eyesore. In the Second World War, air raid shelters were dug in the park, and the grounds were also used to store scrap metal, such as railings and items salvaged from bombed out houses. The Wellington Barracks, which houses companies of the Coldstream, Grenadier, Irish, Scots and Welsh Guards, the regiments responsible for forming the King's Guard, backs onto Birdcage Walk. And it was here, on the 18th of June 1944, that London suffered its worst V-1 flying bomb attack of the war. On that dreadful day, one of Hitler's sinister vengeance weapons smashed into the barracks adjoining Guards Chapel whilst the service was in progress. In the ensuing blast, 121 people were killed, along with another 141 injured. The chapel was rebuilt in the early 1960s, and now serves as a memorial to those who died. Looking at it today, you may be inclined to think that St James's Park is now free of any intrigue or turmoil, and that is mostly the case, although it does have one more strange tale to tell. This is West Island, just moments away from Buckingham Palace. It's reserved for wildlife, and as such is relatively untouched. The park's gardeners venture across on the odd occasion, but generally it's only given a close inspection every 2 years. In March 2011, a tree surgeon was carrying out one such visit when they made a disturbing discovery. A human skeleton hidden amongst the undergrowth. Various items, such as a cushion and vodka bottles, lay alongside the corpse, along with a passport, which identified the deceased as being a 69-year-old American citizen named Robert James Moore. It transpired that Moore, who suffered from mental illness, had been obsessed with Queen Elizabeth II, and over the course of 15 years had sent them on all manner of strange items, including obscene photographs and long letters, some of which are up to 600 pages long. In 2007, Moore travelled to London. There was a record of him visiting the American Embassy, and at some point he snuck across to West Island and set up camp, no doubt with the intention of stalking the Queen. It's not known how long Moore had been in the middle of St James's Lake before he died, although a pathologist concluded he'd passed away 3 years before being discovered, his body lying just yards away from Buckingham Palace and countless passing visitors. A tragic tale, for sure. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this look at the history of St James's Park, and as always, I'd love to hear your own thoughts. Have you visited the park yourself? If so, what was your favourite corner? And what other London parks would you like to see me cover? Please be sure to let me know in the comments. If you haven't yet subscribed to Robslondon, then I'd appreciate it very much if you could please consider doing so, as this, along with clicking the bell icon to receive notifications, will ensure that you don't miss out whenever I publish a new video. Plus, of course, it'd be wonderful to have you along. If you're feeling extra generous, you can also support my work with a tip via either my Ko-fi account, which I'll link below, or the YouTube thanks button, which appears as a heart icon beneath the video. Any such financial donations are of course greatly appreciated, and they really do help go towards creating content. Anyway, on that note, thanks again for watching friends. Stay well, and please be sure to stay tuned.